Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you are doing very well tonight. Welcome to the first of what I'm sure will be many Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers featured on this channel. We're going to kick things off by talking about Arlinn, the Pack's Hope, and we do have to say, just to address the elephant in the room as opposed to the wolves in the room, this is a leak and is thus not official quite yet. However, for the purposes of this analysis, I think we can proceed in the assumption that she is legit, that the leak is legit for two major reasons. Number one, even though spoiler season officially starts tomorrow, as usual, they've trickled out a few things ahead of schedule. And beyond that, they've also talked a lot about what we can expect from the set, giving hints, all this type of stuff that you usually see, and thematically, mechanically, and stylistically, Arlinn seems to track with what we've seen and heard of thus far. The second point I'd like to raise is that I think this card would frankly be a lot more pushed if this was actually just a fake, you know? So with those two things in mind, I'm relatively certain that this is a legitimate leak, and thus we need to answer the question, will she Jund? She's a planeswalker, she can grind, thus we need to at least talk about it. She's obviously very, very cool too. In order to analyze this card, I think we need to begin by talking about the brand new mechanic of Daybound, and by the way, just sorry for the poor quality. Again, this is a leak. That's why the card you're looking at is pretty darn blurry here, but nothing we can do about that. So Arlinn is two-sided, rather like the Innistrad werewolves of yore in the original Innistrad block. Her front side is Daybound, and her back side is Nightbound. So we've got lots to wonder about those effects. What exactly do they mean? Well, conveniently, there was yet another accompanying leak discussing the new mechanics of Daybound and Nightbound. Let us begin there in order to analyze Arlinn more accurately. So, if it becomes day or night, or if a Daybound permanent enters the battlefield, track day and night for the rest of the game. As it becomes day, transform all Nightbound permanents. Conversely, as it becomes night, transform all Daybound permanents. If a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. Conversely, in the same vein as the original Innistrad block, but with one big difference, if a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn, it becomes day next turn. So again, no spells during a turn, it becomes night. It becomes night when it was day. If a player casts 2 spells, that's how you make the sun rise again and turn it back to day. However, there is a big difference. So if you look at the exact wording of an old classic, like Huntmaster of the Fells, it reads, at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform Huntmaster of the Fells, and at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player cast 2 or more spells last turn, transform Ravager of the Fells. Note that it says a player, whereas the new day and night mechanic says if a player casts no spells or at least 2 spells respectively during their own turn, it becomes night or day next turn. So that is a subtle difference, but one that is well worth mentioning. The final aspect of this Daybound and Nightbound mechanic is that when it's night, permanents enter the battlefield Nightbound. So what I'd say about that change is it just generally allows a player that plays more at instant speed to control the tempo of night versus day, control exactly what's going on in the broader world, and to the extent that that will matter in Modern, I remain a little bit skeptical, but it is worth noting. However, having established what Daybound and Nightbound do, let's tab back over to Arlinn. Alright, so Arlinn the Pack's Hope is the front half, the Daybound half, and thus we have to assume that the night and day stuff will not totally take over Modern, and therefore she will be entering almost always as Daybound, as the front half, as the Pack's Hope. She is a 4 mana, 2 gray, 1 red, 1 green planeswalker with 4 loyalty. So this is yet another way in which she compares to Huntmaster of the Fells. In terms of the casting cost, it's the exact same. So Arlinn the Pack's Hope is Daybound. She comes in with 4 loyalty, as we said. And let's start by looking at her -3. Create 2 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. Now that is once again very similar to Huntmaster in that you leave behind 2 bodies at a minimum when this card resolves. You also get an additional effect on top of that, even beyond where the transformation takes in. Huntmaster of the Fells gives you yet another ETB ability, gain 2 life, whereas Arlinn will leave herself behind, a 1 loyalty planeswalker. So right away, you can see why we're interested in asking whether this Juns, because the kind of resolution of a card like this is broadly similar to the resolution of a card that has been deemed Jund-worthy for quite a long time now. Now, Huntmaster may not be purely best in class anymore, and we'll talk a little bit more about how their respective options fit into, you know, a typical Jund shell, because I think they would be competing for a sideboard slot most likely, but it's not ridiculous to talk about Arlinn, because it's very similar to Huntmaster, it seems, in power level. Arlinn's +1. Until your next turn, you may cast creature spells as though they had flash, and each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Now, this is definitely interesting insofar as that Daybound and Nightbound mechanic is concerned, because remember, you are only transforming from night back to day if you cast at least 2 spells during their own turn, so in theory, Arlinn's Flash could help you keep it to night while still deploying threats, if that matters. Now, that's a lot of ifs and a lot of situational stuff, but it's just worth mentioning. Beyond that, of course, when we're speaking more broadly, if you're playing against permission, and if you're playing against sorcery speed removal, deploying creatures with Flash is actually pretty darn good. In a typical Jund shell with Bloodbraid Elf having haste, you're not necessarily going to make much use out of that, at least compared to a lot of other decks. However, Flash Tarmogoyf pretty cool, Flash Spyro to get around the, you know, permission of a control player, or perhaps overload their permission on the end step, then untap and try to play another Haymaker. We all know how good that can be, and each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Could this possibly allow you to live the dream of a heretofore unimaginably big Tarmogoyf? Yes. Could it also work well with, you know, the smaller stuff like Spyro? Absolutely. So I don't know if this is better or worse on the front half, on the face of it, than Huntmaster of the Fells, but it is interesting, and it is at least comparable. But what about that back half? So the flip side is Arlinn the Moon's Fury, and the Moon's Fury is Nightbound, so once again, if for any reason it is night, this card will enter with Arlinn the Moon's Fury that side up. And that's probably a little bit worse for us on average in Jund, but certainly not strictly worse, because of course we want the immediate value. We want to be able to create those 2 Green Wolf creature tokens and X for 1 the opponent, and then try to further accrue advantage from there. And this doesn't really give you any kind of a reliably powerful, grindy X for 1 when it enters Nightbound, but that shouldn't happen almost ever in Modern unless they've got some really crazy stuff in store for us with the rest of this set. Anyway, what do her abilities do? So she's got a +2, adding 1 red and 1 green. If by chance she does enter Nightbound, of course you'll still start with that same loyalty of 4. So adding adding red and adding green at least would allow you to double spell, but of course, in a deck like Jund, in a format like Modern, by the time you get to 4 mana and you're resolving a 4 mana Planeswalker, one of the last things you need to do in most situations is add more mana. Not exactly the greatest possible use case of a flipped Planeswalker. Now, is it? It's no Garruk Veil Cursed, or is it? Because there's another ability, we've got a 0 ability. Until end of turn, Arlinn the Moon's Fury becomes a 5/5 werewolf creature with Trample, Indestructible, and Haste. And that's definitely pretty interesting, because in theory, you could player, make a couple wolves, then it gets flipped to night, and then you are attacking with 9 power on the board next turn, all from a Planeswalker. Not too bad, right? Kind of an army in a can. In theory, it's got same energy here as Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, in that it can make 2/2s and then it can animate itself. And Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, is a card that has seen a little bit of sideboard mid-range play down the years in Abzan and Dead Guy Ale, right? So that's the first thing to compare it to. The second thing to compare Arlinn the Moon's Fury to, of course, is, once again, Huntmaster of the Fells, in this case, the back half Ravager of the Fells. Now, the thing about Huntmaster that's really, really nice is how good it can be against small creature decks. You are, of course, making 2 relevant bodies, gaining 2 life, which is relevant against aggro strategies, and then, of course, if you're able to flip to Ravager, you get to control the opponent's board as well. If all of this stuff lines up, this just kind of solos the opponent, right? However, if we're looking at Arlinn the Moon's Fury, you can animate an attacker, and, you know, if you're thinking about a board state where Ravager of the Fells could flip and could also kill things, then maybe your 5/5 indestructible trample hasty attacker is also very good against that small creature board. If, though, and this is a big if, you have the luxury of taking an offensive posture. And that is definitely not always the case, but it's also very, very good in a much wider variety of matchups. If you just need to be the aggro, you just need to close it out. This final ability reminds me of Nissa Vital Force, in that, of course, she is first and foremost a grindy card. You can do the -3 if you need immediate value, you need a guaranteed 2-for-1. Often you will be gunning for that -6, virtually guaranteeing your own victory in any kind of a grindy situation against any kind of a fair deck. But another use case of Nissa is +1ing just to get a clock going. And I remember back in the day, I used to actually bring Nissa Vital Force, who was in my sideboard as my grindy slot in the Rock. I would bring her in against Tron, because she was better than like a Fatal Push. It's a 5-mana clock, pretty slow, but you know what? When you're hitting with a 5/5, it does end the game pretty quickly. It can pressure planeswalkers as well. And so it's kind of interesting how Arlinn, the Pax Hope, between her Daybound front side and her Nightbound backside, kind of refers us back to a few different cards that have rocked and have junded over the years. Again, we're talking about Gideon Ally of Zendikar, we're talking about Nissa Vital Force, and most of all, we're talking about Huntmaster of the Fells. That's why this card is interesting. The bad news is that all those cards, to varying degrees, have been outclassed a little bit, or frankly a lot, down the years. So it is definitely no slam dunk, but I also think it is not completely crazy to test Arlinn the Pax Hope in that type of grindy, mid-rangey slot in a sideboard that many Jund players still dedicate one spot to. The final thing I'd like to say, by way of fleshing out this comparison with Huntmaster, and, you know, I'm showing you both different arts here. There's some debate as to which art is better. I'm agnostic on this situation. I love both. But one underrated aspect of Huntmaster, or perhaps it's rated well enough is the main reason he still squeezes his way into some Jund sideboards, is because he allows you to bring in something relevant against burn, something relevant against prowess, without dedicating a narrow slot to it. If you look at a card like Weather the Storm, it is quite narrow. We're looking at, obviously, very, very good in the right situations against burn, less good but still worth bringing in against prowess, and then against combo decks like Storm, like the namesake it refers back to, sure, right? But overall, a very, very narrow card relative to the cards that we're talking about here. And this is actually a strike against Arlinn the Pax Hope, because aside from making those bodies and helping to race, she doesn't stabilize and boost your life total, whereas Huntmaster guarantees you 2 life upon ETB and can flip to control the board, then flip back for more life gain, can really scale you out of sight against a burn or prowess opponent, assuming you've achieved parity. Arlinn can lay no such claims to this type of life gain effect, thus is not as much a jack of all trades in your sideboard as Huntmaster is. But there you go, my friends. It is by definition an incomplete analysis here, because she's literally the first Daybound and Nightbound card we've seen, and perhaps her overall efficacy could live or die based on whether there are other Daybound and Nightbound cards in potentially the Jund colors as a whole, or indeed the format more broadly. So there you go, my friends. That was our first spoiler video. Thank you very much for watching. Shout out to a few new patrons that we've had here. I forgot to prepare myself to shout you out at the beginning of the video, and I'm not going to just do it at the end. Next spoiler video I make, I will shout our new Inquisitors out. There are 3 or 4 of them that have joined since my last gameplay vid. So thanks again, guys, to you, patrons, to all viewers, and I'll talk to you soon. Let me know what you think about Arlinn, the Pack's Hope.